The Spanish Civil War was one of the key moments in the history of the 20th century. A clash of ideologies, an armed conflict, a brutal war that tore the nation apart. Although the fighting itself began in July 1936, the situation had been escalating for decades. The generals who rebelled against Spain's democratically elected government were intent on reversing the course of social, cultural, and political reform. The coup escalated into a fratricidal conflict that lasted for 3 long years. According to many observers, the internationalization of the conflict turned it into a pan-European struggle between fascism and democracy. When U.S. Ambassador Claude Bowers claimed that he was watching a dress rehearsal for World War II, he was not far from the truth. Until Franco's death in 1975, the history of the war consisted only of pro-regime accounts written by regime supporters and the works of foreign historians, mostly British and North American. These days, however, Spanish historians are once again writing the annals of their nation and trying to make sense of the conflict that tore the country apart for decades. In April 1931, after the fall of General Miguel Primo de Rivera's 7-year dictatorship and the flight of King Alfonso XIII, Spain was declared a truly democratic republic for the first time. For Republican and socialist politicians and for thousands of rural and urban toilers, the new regime was a promising symbol of modernization, democracy, and social justice. The Republican Socialist Coalition embarked on an ambitious program of change, plans that included labor and agrarian reform, separation of church and state, and depoliticization of the military. In November 1933, a right-wing coalition was formed. It favored the repeal of the reforms of the previous 2 years. In October 1934, when the para-fascist party Spanish Confederation of the Independent Right (CIDA) joined the government, the socialists went on strike. In Asturias it escalated into armed demonstrations. General Franco, with the help of the African army, brutally suppressed the uprising. Nevertheless, in February 1936, a coalition of leftists and Republicans' Popular Front won the parliamentary elections. Under the leadership of Manuel Azaña, they were determined to continue the reforms. Things were soon to change. Manuel Azaña was one of the most influential Spanish politicians of the 20th century. During the Second Republic he was Minister of War, twice Prime Minister and President during the Civil War. He was the founder of the political party of the Republican Left and an ardent supporter of military and educational reforms. After the February 1936 election, right-wing politicians and army generals feared the Bolshevization of the left. They began secretly planning an uprising. Members of the fascist phalanx movement clashed in the streets with left-wing activists, and politicians and society became divided. Force was increasingly used to resolve political conflicts. On July 13, a prominent right-wing leader, José Calvo Sotelo, was assassinated by the Republican military. The attack was retaliation for the murder of their colleague Lieutenant José Castillo. This event gave the generals, led by Emilio Mola, a pretext for a coup. On July 17, military garrisons in Morocco revolted. The mutiny quickly spread to mainland Spain, dividing the army and the entire country, politically and geographically. Emilio Mola was the chief organizer and leader of the 1936 coup d'état. He had served in the army during the Moroccan War and in 1930 became Director of Security. This is where his conflict with the Republicans began. Together with Franco, he coordinated and organized the brutal suppression of rebellions in Spain. He died in a plane crash in June 1937. Although the Civil War was based on internal conflict, international forces had a decisive influence on its outcome. Under the terms of the Agreement on Non-Intervention of Major World Powers, both sides of the conflict were barred from buying or receiving arms. However, the agreement was constantly violated, primarily by Nazi Germany, Italy, and the USSR. But while the Republicans lacked arms and equipment despite the Soviet Union's help, the nationalists received arms from the German nationalists in a steady stream. This key factor in Franco's victory led to the demise of the Republic. At the very beginning of the war, Hitler and Mussolini provided airplanes to move the nationalist African army from Morocco to mainland Spain. This was one of the most significant phases of foreign intervention in the war, highly influential in its outcome. The international brigades were made up of volunteers who fought on the side of the Republic. They were organized by the Comintern, Communist International. Over 35,000 people joined the brigades in the International Sanitary Service, many of whom had fled fascist dictatorships in Europe. The brigades were mostly composed of citizens of France, Germany, Poland, and Italy, and were joined by volunteers from England, America, and Canada. The uprising led to terror in both zones. Rebels in their territories arrested and executed those associated with leftists and Republicans. This purge was authorized by the military, who considered violence necessary to cleanse Spain. In the Republican zone, revolutionary violence erupted against perceived supporters of the coup. Large landowners, local political bosses, industrialists, officers, priests, and other right-wingers. By November 1936, the rebel army had reached the outskirts of Madrid. Convinced of an imminent takeover of the city, the Republican government fled to Valencia. Nevertheless, the nationalist offensive was thwarted by brave citizens and militia units determined to make Madrid the grave of fascism. On November 8, the citizens of Madrid joyfully welcomed the 11th Interbrigade. Having received the first batch of Soviet weapons, they played a decisive role in the defense of the capital. On February 7, 1937, Italian and Spanish troops overcame the weak defenses of the southern city of Malaga. Republicans were captured and executed en masse. Emboldened by this success, Mussolini persuaded Franco to launch an offensive on two sides east of Madrid. The Italians were to attack Guadalajara, supported by the Spanish, who were moving from the Jarama River toward the town of Alhaya de Henares. However, the Italian offensive was stymied by difficult weather conditions and determined Republican resistance. There was no attack by Franco's army. To Mussolini's fury and horror, his troops were completely defeated. Militias. Women in the Republican zone. In the Republican zone, women participated massively in the political movement, joining existing parties, labor unions, and women's political groups. Moreover, women took up arms. The militias, miliciana, dressed in blue jumpsuits, became a powerful symbol of revolution and anti-fascist resistance. However, this bold rebellion against gender stereotypes did not last long. As the war continued, women returned to the home front, where they did social work, nursed the sick, and worked in industrial production. Despite their tradition of Catholicism, the people of the Basque Country in northern Spain remained loyal to the Republic. As the rebels approached Bilbao, troops of the German Condor Legion bombed the city of Guernica, destroying it to the ground. The fighting spirit of the Basques was broken, and in June 1937, Bilbao surrendered. The Republicans tried to ease the onslaught by launching an attack on Brunit, but the numerical superiority of the nationalists forced them to retreat. The rebels continued to advance northward and entered Santander in late August. In response, the Republic opened a front in Aragon, planning to capture Zaragoza. Interbrigades took Quinto and Belchite, but the main objective remained elusive. By October, the Basque Country and Asturias had fallen to the rebels. Francisco Franco Bahaman was born in Ferrol, La Coruna, in December 1892. He was from a military family and as a young soldier participated in the colonial war in Spanish Morocco. Franco belonged to a group of rebellious generals who planned and executed the July 1936 military coup that escalated into the Spanish Civil War. On October 1, 1936, Franco was proclaimed Generalissimo of the military forces in rebel territory and head of the nationalist state. After the victory of his army on April 1, 1939, Franco's dictatorship ruled in Spain until his death in 1975. In December 1937, the Republic launched a surprise attack on Teruel, capturing the city, but Franco's army retook it in February 1938. This was followed by a nationalist operation in Aragon, dividing the territory of the Republic into two parts. The next step was an attack on Valencia. In order to weaken the onslaught, the Republicans and the international brigades crossed the Ebro River. The battle lasted 3 months, after which the exhausted army of the Ebro was forced to retreat across the river again. International involvement largely influenced the course of the war and determined its outcome. At the Munich Conference in September 1938, Britain and France effectively surrendered Czechoslovakia to Hitler. The fate of Spain also depended on political necessity. The Republic did not count on help from the democracies, but Prime Minister Juan Negrin withdrew the international brigades from the fighting, hoping that Franco would also withdraw German and Italian troops. This last call for international diplomacy was not heeded. In the winter of 1938, Franco turned his next target to Catalonia, and in January 1939 his troops entered Barcelona. After the fall of Catalonia in February 1939, a huge wave of refugees crossed the border into France. More than 500,000 citizens of the Republic, soldiers, and members of the international brigades made this irrevocable move to escape Franco's advancing army. On the other side of the border, exhausted and terrified refugees were placed in internment camps by the French authorities. They suffered unbearable conditions, and many died of disease and starvation. Among the most famous refugees was the poet Antonio Machado, who died a few days after crossing the border and was buried by the sea in the town of Collier. One of his most famous poems, The Traveler, conveys a bitter sense of loss, courage and homelessness. In March 1939, Colonel Casado, commander of the Republican Central Army, led a chaotic revolt against his own government. He was dissatisfied with the policy of continued resistance and believed he could negotiate peace without reprisals. Franco rejected his proposals, and Casado was forced to surrender. On March 27, the rebels entered Madrid, and 4 days later they had all of Spain in their hands. The next day Franco declared an end to hostilities. The civil war was over, but for thousands of refugees and war-stricken citizens of the Republic, the terror was just beginning.